This is StoryBeat with Steve Cuden, a podcast for the creative mind. StoryBeat explores how masters of creativity develop and produce brilliant works that people everywhere love and admire. So join us as we discover how talented creators find success in the worlds of imagination and entertainment. Here now is your host, Steve Cuden.
Thanks for joining us on StoryBeat. We're coming to you from the Steel City, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. StoryBeat episodes are available at storybeat.net and on all major podcast apps and platforms. If you like this episode, please take a moment to give us a rating or review. And please, won't you subscribe to StoryBeat wherever you listen to podcasts? My guest today, Steve Bramson, is the Emmy Award-winning composer of hundreds of primetime television episodes and numerous feature films. He scored 10 consecutive seasons of the long-running CBS series Jag. At the time, it was one of a handful of series that utilized a large live orchestra for each of its weekly scores. He received 2 Emmy nominations for his work. He also worked with George Lucas on one of the final episodes of the popular series, The Young Indiana Jones Chronicles. Other TV shows Steve has worked on include The Nine and Journeyman. Steve has also composed the music for many highly acclaimed feature films, including In Enemy Hands, Don McKayle, Decoding Annie Parker, and most recently, Last Call, based on the life of poet Dylan Thomas. He's also done orchestrations for now classic movies such as Apollo 13 with James Horner, James and the Giant Peach with Randy Newman, and Starship Troopers with Basil Poledouris. Steve's versatility was on full display when he scored the popular amusement park ride From the Earth to the Moon, written for Disneyland Paris. He earned a master's degree from the prestigious conservatory, the Eastman School of Music, and while in school, he was noticed by distinguished film composer Laurence Rosenthal. Upon graduation, Rosenthal invited Steve to join him in Los Angeles, where he orchestrated many of Rosenthal's scores. Steve also composed the musical Shimmy with StoryBeat guest, lyricist Pamela Phillips Oland and choreographer Donald McKayle. And he was also one of the first composer fellows in the Sundance Institute's Composers Lab. At the end of today's episode, Steve has gifted us with 2 pieces of his music. The first, Lithe and Well, will be followed by It's You. So be sure to stick around to hear Steve's work. And for all those reasons and many more, it's a great joy for me to have my guest on StoryBeat today, the incredibly talented composer, Steve Bramson. Steve, welcome to the show.
Good to see you. Good to be here.
It's great to have you here. So let's go all the way back to your roots. Where did your love of music and composing first begin? When you were a boy or later?
Probably in utero.
In utero?
Well, probably because my parents were both professional musicians.
Is that right?
I'm joking, but I grew up in a musical household, so music was part of our life everywhere. My mother was a soprano, an operatic soprano, who performed quite often in and around New York City. So she was always singing and she was teaching at home. My father, he was a Juilliard-trained clarinetist, though he pursued a career as an educator and later a businessman. He ran a music school in the community and a music store. Again, music was just around the house all the time. My sister was a couple of years older than me, was already playing harp and then piano. So it was just around all the time.
You were immersed in it everywhere you went.
I was immersed in it. However, I did not, my parents wanted me, like my sister, to start piano very young, probably 5 or 6, but I did not take to it well. I did it, and after a couple of years, I quit. And as we may discover later, I took a sort of a circuitous route to becoming a professional musician, but that was the first instance of my wavering.
Well, would you then say that your parents were, in fact, your earliest inspirations and influences, or were there others that you were listening to who were really influencing you ultimately in the positive way?
Well, the thing that really kind of made me dive into music is something I felt really seriously about was jazz. And so in that sense, probably the big band music my father played around the house, because that was when he was a young man in his 20s, that was where he kind of lived in the musical genre. And so in that sense, I suppose my father was an inspiration. I didn't really, and the music he listened to, I didn't really take to the sound of opera and vocal music, even though I was around it all the time. It took me many years to kind of find my way back to that.
Well, who were the big influences for you from the jazz world? Who did you listen to?
Well, I mean, in terms of my education, there was one man in particular which had a huge impact on me, a man named Mitch Farber. My father, as I said, had a community music school. And around the time I was 12 or 13, he hired this young man who was in his 20s, who had moved to New York to try to be successful. And he became my piano teacher and introduced me to playing piano, playing not just jazz, classical piano, writing, arranging. He had me do takedowns and introduced me to some of the standard tunes that jazz musicians learned in the repertoire.
Well, for the unwashed, including me, actually, I've never heard of. You call it a tick down? What is that?
Takedown. A takedown when you transcribe
a takedown.
So in other words, let's just say a solo by Miles Davis, and you would transcribe it. You'd listen to it and take it down. You could do it as just a single line. And sometimes you take down arrangements. You try to actually listen to all the parts of the band or the orchestra and dissect it and write it down. It's a great way to learn and to get your ears working. But through working with Mitch, he threw a lot of music to me. He got into the habit of assigning me pieces to listen to every week.
Like what? What was he having you listen to?
I mean, I remember he wanted me to go through all the Beethoven piano sonatas, for example, and Hindemith, Moths der Mahler, which is a very famous symphony by Hindemith. And he would tell me, you're going to put these things on, and even if you don't like them, you're going to keep listening to them for the whole week, and with the score follow along. And sure enough, virtually every time, by the time the week was over, if I didn't already, I loved the piece. And so that was an exercise that he had me do. And he also, I can't recall specific examples, but, there were jazz tunes, jazz performances, records that he would say, go home and listen to this. Another memory of an early influence, there was another teacher at my father's school, another jazz pianist, who for my birthday gave me the album of Central Park North, which is an album by a great jazz band, Thad Jones, Mel Lewis, big band. Anybody who knows anything about jazz and big band knows that this band was a huge influence and game changer in writing and arranging for the big band back in the 60s. And I really took to that. And it was just sort of a mixture of things coming from various places. I also had a very important teacher in high school. When I was 8, you remember earlier I said I rebelled against piano lessons.
Yes.
When I was 8, I decided I wanted to play trumpet. And my father had taken me to a high school concert, neighboring high school concert, and I heard this piece performed by their trumpet players, and it got me all excited. So I did that for several years. And then around, when I was a freshman in high school, I lost interest in trumpet. And I had started to study with Mitch, so my interest in jazz and getting back into piano kind of overtook the trumpet, and I quit trumpet. I wanted to play in the newly formed jazz band at the high school, but the teacher wouldn't let me because I wasn't playing in any of the band, in a band or any other ensemble. So he said, if you will play percussion, because you can play piano, you can read, mallet instrument notation, vibraphone, xylophone. It's a similar, layout of the keyboard. If you do that, then you could play piano in the jazz band. And that's what I did. But he was also—
That got you back to the piano.
Yeah, and to play in the jazz band, which is what I wanted to do.
How old were you when you learned to read music?
How young was I?
Yes.
I imagine probably even when I first started, when I was 5 or 6 or 7, whenever it was that I started my very first piano lessons.
Well, that's really young. I mean, that's very young. I suppose probably, that's a really good thing.
In all fairness, it's probably 7. 5 maybe is a little.
Well, but even still, that's really. I mean, you're starting to read music about the same time you're learning to read. Yeah,
that's right. Again, I don't know what it's like for others, but I think growing up in the kind of family that I did, it was sort of an obvious thing to do. And but I think that just looking back, these things I mentioned were very big influences on me. And around the same time, that I switched to piano in high school and played in the band, I formed my own quartet. I mean, I formed it with others. We had a jazz quartet where we would play and write music of our own and go out and get gigs at the local pub or the, parties and stuff.
So you were playing from early on in front of people as well. It wasn't a foreign thing for you to play before others.
Yes, I mean, in terms of the quartet and playing in the ensemble, yes, but I never did any solo recital, like piano recitals. I mean, I had to do them for my, the school, my father's music school. The teachers every year would have their recital, and I choked. I remember playing something and I completely choked, froze. I stopped. I don't even know if I finished the piece or walked away, but I was so terrified.
Huh.
So I never, I went on after that, of course, through college and playing in bands, and I had my own quartet and played in pubs and jazz clubs and stuff. But that never really bothered me so much. But the solo, like, it was just me. I just couldn't deal with it.
Huh, interesting. All right, so eventually you go off to Eastman, which is a very famous conservatory for music. And what was it that you learned there? How did you grow in that way in a conservatory?
Well, if you don't mind my backing up for a second.
Sure, please do.
Because I alluded to this earlier. When I went to college, I didn't know if I wanted to become a musician. I had other interests, and I went to the University of New Hampshire. And I think in my sophomore year, I declared a music major. And about a year or so, year and a half later, I just didn't feel it was working for me. So I quit and switched to another interest of mine. I ended up getting a degree in economics, but I continued to play in the band and write and stuff like that. But what happened was the summer after I graduated, I decided finally to go to the summer program that Eastman offered, that my teacher had been urging me to go to for many years. I never did. And when I went there, it completely blew my mind and opened, me up to a world that I never really knew before. The level.
How so? How did it blow your mind?
Well, the level of musicianship, and this is nothing against University of New Hampshire. I mean, they also had an excellent music department, but they tended to be more directed towards music education, a lot of teachers.
For sure.
And it didn't attract the kind of pool of talent that a school like Eastman would.
Well, of course.
And so when I went, the level of musicianship, the passion of performing, the level of the mastery of the work that was being done, the way the music itself that was being written, I just found really exciting. I didn't hear any of this when I was at UNH, not in the department. I heard it on recordings, but not from my peers. And it was just really thrilling. I remember walking in. They have this beautiful, must be about 100 years old now, theater in Rochester, New York, the Eastman Theater. And I think that was the first place I went when I arrived that summer. And I walked in this gorgeous theater, and on the stage, this sort of jazz orchestra was rehearsing or playing. And I just, it just knocked me out. I just was so exciting. The energy and the style of music too. My ears were just more drawn to jazz and more rich kind of chromatic harmonies than what I kind of imagined and had been around in a lot of the classical music that I had been exposed to by that point, which of course was limiting. But and I just said, this is what I want to do.
So going to Eastman actually turned you toward making this a real profession.
Yeah. And just to back up one more a bit, what really triggered it was when I was graduating from UNH with my degree in economics, I had written an arrangement for the jazz band. And I was planning, or I was imagining, well, what am I going to do with an economics degree? Am I going to get an MBA, I guess, So I was thinking about that. In the spring concert of my graduating year, they programmed an arrangement that I had written. And there was a guest artist, a guy named Buddy DeFranco, very famous, important jazz clarinetist, who was the guest artist. When the concert was over, he found me and asked me if he could buy this arrangement so that he could use it for himself.
Wow.
And that's the thing that really turned the switch for me, because I was not imagining how I could make a life in music. First of all, not only how, but could I? Was I good enough?
Sure.
I had all those doubts. The fact that somebody like that took an interest in my music that's what gave me the courage to go to Eastman that summer, because I hadn't gone. I'd had other opportunities, but I'd been kind of insecure about my, ability and not really sure. So I went. So it was the combination of those two things that really turned me towards.
Was it one of those epiphanies where you went, wait a minute, I can actually get money for this?
Well, it wasn't just about the money. I'll be honest with you, because I think he paid me $50, which back then I guess was still a nice bit, but it was really more. It was sort of an acknowledgement that I have something going on that maybe could take me someplace.
Sure, of course.
And so I went to Eastman, and then what happened there, I went that summer, and when I was there, I discovered that they had a master's program. It was called Jazz Studies in Contemporary Media, and it was designed, unlike a lot of the other programs, to graduate students that would go on to fill positions in orchestras and teachers and so teaching positions, to graduate people who would work as professionals in production, whether it's records, performance, arranging, composing, Broadway. We had to analyze Broadway tunes and shows, and we did all kinds of stuff. But they had a master's program, and I said, well, this is what I need to do. If I want to become a professional musician, I need to go. So I found out what I needed to do to get accepted, and because I didn't have a music degree, I had to fill in a lot of gaps. So I took off a few years and studied privately and kind of caught up on stuff, and I could create a portfolio, and I submitted it, and I got accepted, and I went. That's how that happened.
All right, so let's go flash forward just a tiny bit and to say, as I mentioned in your bio, that you get noticed by Laurence Rosenthal, who's a notoriously great composer. For the audience who doesn't know, tell us a few things that he is known for. What movies or TV shows did he work on?
The ones that come foremost to my mind are The Miracle Worker, probably maybe his most famous.
Right.
Requiem for a Heavyweight, Beckett, Return of a Man Called Horse. There are many others, but he was a very, he got an Oscar nomination for his, as musical director for I think it was Man of La Mancha, the movie.
Right.
And I think he had one other nomination. It might have been for Beckett. I'm not sure. But
so he notices that you've got some kind of skill or ability.
Well, what happened was, like all colleges, they have alumni come back, and he came back, and I knew who he was, and I followed him everywhere and went to all of his talks and stuff, and we got some one-on-one time. So he got to see my music. But what happened was, during my graduate year, I applied for a grant from the school. They offered these grant. It was a pool of money they would offer to students that were to do summer study. And I proposed, I said, gee, I'd love to go out to California and work with Larry if he'd have me. So I wrote up this proposal. It was after I'd worked with him, obviously, there. And he agreed. And so I got, I think, $400. But yes, I asked him, basically is what happened. I said, I'd like to come study with you and watch you work. Would you have me? And he said, yes. And so after I graduated, I went out.
That's really cool when that happens. It obviously doesn't happen for everybody.
No.
So he saw something in you, clearly,
Yes.
that made a difference for him, and that he was willing to have you work for him.
Yeah.
All right. So now you go out there. What were the big important lessons as both a composer and arranger and so on? Because you did mostly orchestrating and arranging for him, correct?
Yeah, that's all I did. That's all I did with him for 5 or 6 years.
All right. So I've had other orchestrators and arrangers on the program, but I think it's always instructive for those that are hearing about this for the first time. Explain to the listeners what an orchestrator and arranger does. What is the reason why you're there? Because
we're talking about film and television scoring, I'll talk about orchestration in that context.
Absolutely.
Even when a composer is, and most composers are skilled enough, knowledgeable enough to do their own orchestration, it's usually a matter of time. Because production schedules are tight, having an orchestrator allows a composer to use shorthand in a way that makes his job, he can get through composing more quickly. So they will write a sketch, essentially, that depending on the composer and how they work will have very little detailed information to an almost complete score, but just in a reduced form. But the job of the orchestrator, depending on the score and who you're working with, can also lie on different points on a scale. When a composer hands the music to be orchestrated to the orchestrator, it could be as thin and bare bones as, here's my melody, and I want it to start here and then here, and these are the points that need to hit, and I need it to be loud here and quiet here, and it needs to be active here. Go home and fill it out. It could be as bare bones as that.
Fill it out, meaning add instrumentation to it.
Yes. In other words, we've got a 60-piece orchestra. We've got double woodwinds. We've got 4 horns, 2 trombones. Whatever you give you the instrumentation. You go home, take this information, and you make my music sound great. I've given you instructions. You have material. You go home and you do it, and you write it out on the score page. And then when you're done,
all you have to start at that juncture in the bare bones way is just a melody, basically.
I'm going from one extreme to the other. On one extreme, you may have a melody sketched across the bar and maybe filled in exactly where it's supposed to be, with maybe some chord symbols notated to indicate the harmonies, maybe a few suggestions of a counterline, notations of, I want this big, I want this small, I want it active. Here I want to shift to this key. Like that, it could be that kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm.
On the other end, you can be given a sketch where there's really no decisions that the orchestrator really has to make at all. And there, what he's doing is he's taking generally a condensed score. You can almost imagine, like, say, a piano part or a very detailed piano part, and then realize it for the orchestra. But every note is there. There's really very little you need to add, other than it's almost a music preparation function where you're transferring to the score page, you're almost copying. But as you're doing it, you're also making sure that everything lines up correctly, that there aren't errors that you see. And also, when you meet with a composer, you will have conversations. What are you wanting to do here? What about this? I see you've written this line here in the bassoon, but what if I were to add the violas to that? What do you think about that? You'd have these kind of conversations. So there is some input in it, but it's the composer has much more control over the ultimate sound than the first version I gave you.
Well, my imagination tells me that the orchestrator or arranger is taking the composer's vision and bringing it to life. It's not the arranger's vision; it's the composer's vision.
That's the job, and that's why, even with the very bare bones version I gave you, like, I've been in situations where I've recorded on a tape my meetings with the composer to talk about all this, what his vision is exactly. Like, even if it's not on the page he's giving me, I will ask him, what is it you're going for here? And I'll have it to refer to later when I'm working. I want it to sound mystical. I'd like to hear upper woodwinds through this section, but so I'm being given instructions verbally instead of notationally on the page. But it just allows composers that are working under extreme pressure, time pressure, to work more quickly. But it also it's a function of how the composer likes to work. Larry was a guy, he studied with Nadia Boulanger, which is one of the most important educators of composers, would go to France to study with her.
With Boulanger, yeah.
Nadia Boulanger. And so he was a fabulous pianist. He was a graduate of Eastman, obviously. He was an alumni there. So he was able to do all of this work himself. And so his sketches were incredibly detailed. There was very little for me to add, other than, as I say, when we go through it, I might say I make a suggestion. What if we did this? What if we did that? And some of you would approve, some of you would not. And then I would go home and just make sure everything was correct on the page, so that the copyist could then extract the parts for the musicians.
Interesting. All right. So then how long was it that you were working as his orchestrator before you started to compose on your, as your own composer?
There was kind of an overlap, because while I was, after I moved here to California, even while I was working with him and in between projects, I would try to meet people. I would ring up other contacts I might have gotten, or visit people I'd met, and I'd go to sessions and introduce myself to people. And at that time, there also was a pretty a strong system in the studios of music supervisors. So there was a music supervisor that was the head of the music department in various studios, including not just the big, 20th Century Fox and Paramount, but also production companies like Lorimar was one. I don't think they exist anymore, or Viacom, that produced their own television, and they would have a head of music, and they were very accessible and they were very open. If you call them up, they'd take your call and you'd introduce yourself, and they'd invite you in to meet, and maybe leave a cassette off to listen to. I don't think this kind of thing happens much anymore, as far as I know. So I did that kind of thing, and people got my name here and there. And I have to say, and I'll tell you a quick funny story, but the mere fact that I could say that I work with Larry was a huge deal, as you can imagine.
It opened doors for you, I'll bet.
It opened doors, but it just gave me a immediate credibility. When I was in New York, I moved to New York City after I graduated, before I came out to California. And I was living in New York when Larry finally called to say, come on out and work with me that first summer that I was going to. But I was looking for work in New York. And I remember New York is more of a, at the time was more about advertising and jingles and stuff like that, and film scoring. But
right.
I found a list of production houses, and I decided to send a letter to everybody saying, introducing myself. I just graduated from Eastman. I just came back from, it was after I worked with Larry. I'd come back from LA before I moved permanently. And I said, I just come back working with Larry Rosenthal. I'm going to be sending you a cassette of my music. Within a week, I got a phone call from a guy. Said, I need somebody to help me out of this mess I'm in on this score, this movie that I've been hired to do. Can you come and write this music for me? He didn't even want to hear any music. The mere fact that he saw that I worked with Larry, he knew who Larry was, said, that's good enough for me. That's the kind of thing that happens sometimes.
Well, that's a door opener for sure, because you're guilty by association, or you're approved by association. That's a wonderful thing. I mean, it's really helpful, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm eternally grateful.
All right, so let's talk about movie and TV music, which is to say, music in general, and correct me if I'm wrong, is about emotion. It's about passion. It's about feelings. It's not about intellectuality or academic thinking. It's about emotion. So where do you draw your inspiration? Where do you look for emotion? In the images that you see when you're working on a TV show or a movie?
Yeah, I would say I'm a very visual person. And I think that a lot of times what I'm reacting to is what I'm seeing. Of course, sometimes what's being said too, which is, if I, the nature of the dialogue and the scene, the combination of the visuals and the spoken word that combine give the impression of the emotion.
Mm-hmm.
All of that. I definitely pick up on that. I've often read of guys writing music to scripts, without picture.
Interesting.
And I've never, well, I shouldn't say I've never done that, but I've rarely done that. And there's an argument to be made to defend that way of working. I understand that, but knowing myself, that's not as natural an environment for me to create than to when I'm working on a film project, at least, and then to see it.
Well, if somebody were successful at doing that, the audience would never know.
That's true.
At the end of the day, we all work for anybody that's in the entertainment industry that presents product to an audience. The audience doesn't care what you went through to do it. They just care about the end result.
That's right.
So how you get there, that's what I'm fascinated by, is how you, a successful professional, how you get there, because that they may inspire others.
I respond to what I'm seeing and hearing when I watch the footage of the film.
So do you read scripts before you start work, or do you just wait for picture?
When I'm given the opportunity to read a script, I do. Yeah, I'm not always given an opportunity. A lot of times I'm brought in after it's shot, and there's no point in reading a script, really.
Sure, of course. Well, there's no substitute for having the picture, that's for sure.
But I mean, like the last two projects I did were with the same director, and in both cases I read the script first. And that's because he hired me before he started shooting.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, for the first film, I actually went, he wanted me to come to the set thinking that it would inspire me. I don't know if it inspired me, but I certainly found it fascinating and interesting, because I'd never really, particularly working in television, it's such a fast turnaround. By the time I'm spotting one show, they're editing the next one coming down the pipe. So
you as a composer are generally speaking after the fact. You're not pre-production. You're usually in post in some way.
Yes, but as I mentioned, I have read of and know of composers who've been asked by their directors to start writing music before they shoot, and they'll play it back on the set while they're shooting, or they'll use it during editing, even before the composer's really seen anything.
Well, isn't that ideal, Steve? We hear about temp tracks, or somebody puts existing music that has nothing to do with the movie into, and then the edit gets stuck in that temp track, and the composer gets stuck with that rhythm.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, because of how I started, particularly you had asked me about, when did I start doing my own composing?
Mm-hmm.
My introduction to a career as a composer was in television and not in movies. And, I just, a lot of times, until later, even with JAG, but before JAG, I was brought in on series that had already been on the air. So there already was sort of an idea of what the score was supposed to sound like.
Right.
It already, established an idea and a theme and all that. So I was more of the guy who had to come in and do what was asked of me, not to come in and bring my ideas to them. I mean, yes, I need to craft a good score, one that fit the picture, but I wasn't shaping the sound of these projects.
Well, that's the equivalent to me, because most of my writing has been in TV, and I'm on a series someone else has created or it already exists. So you're writing in their world. You're not creating something whole cloth, brand new that nobody's ever seen before or heard before. You're using their underpinnings as what you're working on.
Yes.
Same thing. That's what you're talking about.
It is the same thing. And so, so this idea of kind of creating the world yourself from the beginning, I have had some, later I worked on a couple series where I was able to do that more, and also with these movies.
Where you created the title theme and that sort of thing?
Yeah, well, they didn't actually, by the time these shows, they've disbanded with the title. They just have these like bumpers that would start the show.
Right.
So there wasn't anything, there was no theme.
Well, the best one of those was Lost, which was just kind of like an ethereal, ooh, and that was the end of it.
Yeah. The Nine, which I did, and Journeyman both worked that way. Well, the Journeyman, I think they found something, I forgot what it was, but I had nothing to do with it. It was very short. But the score, the sound of the score was my creation, working with the producer and stuff.
Interesting. All right. Well, so obviously one of the big parts of your career was working on JAG for 10 years.
Yeah.
You don't have a military background, correct? No. So where did that come from? Did you just listen to a lot of military style music? Is that how you worked it?
Well, I mean,
how that happened?
If you listen to the underscore, yes, there are certain episodes that lean more heavily on the militaristic, the march and the solo trumpet and the snare drum. There's definitely that, but a lot of it is just drama, and it could be almost any story, really.
Right.
But in terms of that specifically, I guess I would say part of it is listening to what Bruce Broughton, who wrote the theme and the pilot, established for the show. I knew I could hear what that was. I also did listen to my share of marches when I was young. My father led a military band when he was in the service, so I heard stuff. I knew about those, but there wasn't that much of that kind of stuff in JAG. And I guess also just, the kind of training I had, I was trained to kind of be a man who could wear many hats. I learned and listened to all kinds of different stuff. So it wasn't, that wasn't one of the bigger challenges for me.
So what were the bigger challenges?
I think just being able to step into, as we said earlier, something that was already created and to do it successfully,
hopping on a moving train.
Yeah. But I mean, the fact that, Bruce recommended me, was a huge boost of confidence too. I felt pretty secure.
Sure.
If he said, hire Steve, that I could do this. And I think the other big challenge, and you may know this too, Steve, from your work in television, is one of the biggest challenges was keeping up the pace of that kind of work.
Well, that was going to be my next question. So let's just explore it. What did you do? How did you handle the relentless pace of it coming at you over and over again for weeks on end? How do you handle that?
I just did it. I just stayed. I put in long hours, and didn't sleep as much as I wanted to. And you just kind of press on. I mean, I think there was a kind of a thrill. There's this sort of that energy of just a rush of having to meet the pressures being put on you and race to get it through. That drove me.
You were working on a top-rated TV show, and so a lot of people are paying attention.
Yes, and as you mentioned earlier too, I had an orchestra to work with every week, 30 to 35 musicians. That in itself was extremely exciting for me. I mean, the high point of all of the work was being on the scoring stage and hearing my music. The work at home could be tedious at times. In fact, it often was tedious. But being able to keep up with that pace, and also as the years went on, keeping the inkwell full. After a while, you're writing the same stories, the same characters.
Oh, I know.
To keep it new and fresh, that was challenging.
And so did you have any tricks for doing that? Was it just keeping at it?
Keeping at it.
Keeping at it.
I mean, the one thing that I did was I tried to think of each episode as its own little mini movie in a sense. So I would introduce new themes in almost every episode, with the exception of, the hero of the show had a theme, and the show itself had a theme. And later, a couple of secondary characters had themes. But in terms of the mood and the tone, and even sometimes instrumentation, I would try to every episode as its own thing, and that presented a new challenge for me every week by doing that.
And how often would you hit sort of little bits of brick walls, or did you never hit them?
Oh, I would hit them. I mean, I think it became harder as years into it, 4, 5, 6 years into the series, because I did it for almost 10 years.
Well, you don't want to repeat yourself, and that's what they're asking you to do, is to repeat yourself, only in a new way, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it became hard. But even within episodes, there would be a cue here or there where I would just draw a blank. And, like probably anybody else, what I do is I move to something else. I move to a different section of the movie of the show to, tackle that and then come back.
You're taking that central processing unit in your head and trying to give it a break and go somewhere else so that you get some inspiration. Yeah.
Right. Or leave the studio and go for a walk, whatever. Did
you conduct most of your scores?
I conducted all of them.
All of them?
Almost all of them. There's one or two I maybe didn't, but almost all.
And that's a big rush, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It is, again, hearing your music performed by these incredible musicians, stuff that's lived in your head. Because the other thing, now we all work differently, but then I was at a piano with a pencil and paper. There were no virtual mock-ups. There were no synth mock-ups or anything.
Oh, this was before synthesizers.
Before synthesizers as a composing tool.
As a tool.
You would see them on the stage, and the musicians would have them to play.
Sure. I didn't mean that they didn't exist. I meant that you didn't compose on them. You composed on on a good old-fashioned keyboard, keyboard on a piano.
With a pencil and paper, and I'd leave these scores out, and the elves would come pick them up, and the next day the parts would be on the stand.
Wow. How often would you get in there and somebody screwed up those parts?
Not often.
Not often.
They're great. It's incredible when you think about the production involved. I mean, we're seasons of 22 episodes. You don't go 22 weeks back to back, but you may go 5 weeks back to back and then have a week off or something like that. But even that, going at that rate, doing 20 minutes, maybe 25 minutes of music every week for 30 to 35 players. The score is usually written in about 5 days, handed off. I would finish writing at midnight maybe, and I'd leave my packet out, and then they'd pick it up at 3 or 4 in the morning. And then they'd go home, and I would do this every night. And then the day of the session, I'd show up, and there it was.
That's got to feel a little bit like a miracle, yeah?
It is a miracle. And what adds to the miracle is also the fact that musicians, they don't rehearse this stuff. They don't see it.
They sight read it.
They sight read it. And I mean, you know, you read it once, you read it twice, and you're done. You record it and you move on. You know, and you don't have the luxury. I mean, if you're doing a huge, you know, tens of $1 million feature film where there's, you know, padding of money everywhere, then yeah, you can nitpick and take your time. But you had to get this done in 3 hours or 5 hours or whatever the session was.
So what was for people who don't know, including me, what is it like to stand in the middle of all of that sound coming at you?
It's thrilling. It's thrilling, but also because of just the kind of person I am, I'm also very nervous. You know, is this going to work? What did I do? You know, but, you know, almost always I was okay, you know, but it was thrilling, you know, absolutely.
And can you share any story that was like it just didn't work, and how did you solve that? Was there anything that was a disaster, and how did you solve it?
No disasters, but unlike today, where people work on workstations and submit their work for critique before it's finalized, and you can get notes from your director, your producer, and make the changes before you're done. Because we didn't do that then, I'd have to do it there. So often I would have a cue, we'd do it, and the producer would say, you know, that thing you did over the shot isn't working for me. What can you do to fix that? I mean, that would happen frequently because
on the spot,
because, well, we didn't have any, there was no other way to do it then. And so, you know, you'd have to think about it. And I mean, I'll just, you know, make up something. It could be, you know, assigning the part to a different instrument. Like maybe she said, it's not heroic enough. All right, so give it to the brass. I mean, something simple and cheap like that. But it could also be, you know, a quick rewrite of a few bars, you know, take a figure that had written that was wrong and either maybe borrow it from somewhere else and plug it in there. A lot of times instructions to fix things are like, you'd say, okay, oboe, I'd like you to take what you have in bar 3 and now put it in bar 7, but take it down a step, you know, stuff like that. You just kind of throw it together.
And the musicians would just do it, wouldn't they?
Yeah. Well, they all have pencils and they write it in, and yeah, they do that.
But I mean, they don't really rehearse it or practice it. They don't go away and practice it. They just do it.
No, they just do it.
I think that's probably one of the most amazing things about what you wind up doing is that you hand it over to a whole bunch of different people who come together as a group with literally zero or just a tiny bit of practice.
Yeah.
I think that's pretty amazing. All right. So let's talk about this process of actually writing cues. You would receive footage in some way. I assume, did you get it by video, or you didn't get it from a computer though?
Then it was videotape. It was video cassette.
Okay. So now somebody shows you, here's the scene or scenes or whatever it is, and you have X amount of time that you need to put music into because it's going to have a finite length of time to it.
Yeah.
What generally was your first step? Were you sitting back and trying to feel your way through it? What was generally your first step?
Do you want me to speak specifically about JAG or just in general?
Oh, you can use JAG as an example, but in general, whichever is clearer. But if JAG helps, use JAG for sure.
In the case of JAG, because the theme, I already had a theme. I think one thing, you know, first of all, of all these kinds of scoring projects, there's something called a spotting session, which I assume has come up before in your talks, probably.
But explain it again.
So the spotting session is a meeting where the composer meets with the director and our producer, along with often a music editor and maybe the editor, picture editor, and you discuss where exactly music will go. Because of course, you know, it's not, you know, music starts in the first frame and continues without stop to the last frame. It comes out, it goes in, it goes out, goes in and out throughout the whole project. So you spot the film for where the music will be.
Because it doesn't necessarily want to be everywhere.
No, it should probably never be everywhere. I mean, maybe in some cases, but
sometimes silence is as cool a sound as music.
In fact, a lot of what happens, a lot of what determines where the cue begins is preceded by a discussion about the silence. Let's wait for the end of this line. There's a nice pause after he says this. Or when the camera finishes its push-in, or as it's pushing in, give it a breath. That kind of conversation. Those sort of things will happen a lot. But the spotting session is a session where you determine and discuss not only where the music will go, where it comes in and where it goes out, but also what is it doing? What is it you want the music to do here? I think this needs to support the internal dialogue of this character. You know, he's not speaking about it, but we know this is what he's feeling inside.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
You know, or it may be more overt. We want the music to support what we're seeing. You know, she's running down the street, trying to catch him before he leaves, and I need to feel that energy, whatever it is. But you have these discussions, and the music editor is like a note taker, an assistant, one part of the job, and they will compile a list of all these cues, the decisions of where the cues will go with the notes. Director says he'd like to feature flute here. Director says, please be careful not to let the cue go too long. You know, whatever the notes were that we talked about, those
Right.
would all be written out. And so I get this list at home. So now I'm looking at the video, and the first thing I do is I'll watch the whole thing, and I'll look at my notes, and I'll see, okay, so that's the scene where, okay, I got that. Then I'll go on, okay, nothing here. Okay, here's the next cue. And I go through the whole thing, and I kind of take a mental inventory of what it is I need to do for this show. And I've already started to kind of put things in sort of their spaces. Okay, I need, you know, I know I have this instrumentation, so I can hear this cue is going to be heavily strings and quiet. But here I need to use more brass. And well, here's another one I'm going to have more, you know, so these are related. So I kind of start to put it together that way.
And those instruments to you represent certain feelings and emotions?
Well, it's more like I'm gathering my tools. It's like, okay, I know I'm going to do this kind of music. So I know I'm going to want to have this group of musicians. At the least, these are the kind of instruments I'm going to want for this mood that I want to create. It's a starting place.
So one of the fascinating things to me about movie and TV music is that we are in a business in which we deal only in sight and sound. We only can see and hear things. We can't smell, we don't taste, we don't touch, we see and hear. It's on a screen and so on. And the music sort of fills in these emotional gaps that may not necessarily be obvious to an audience and helps the audience understand.
Right.
I find that very fascinating about music. And the best example I can give is if anybody's ever watched a whole film with no score to it,
yes,
it's an entirely different experience than when you have the music.
I'm always fascinated by the power of music. Obviously, I have a slanted view, a biased view of it, but it's really true. You know, there's so many instances. If you really pay attention sometime, next time you're watching something, if you pay attention to how the music enters, okay, you're in a scene where it's quiet, there may be dialogue and sound effect, but there's no music. But if you pay attention to what happens when the music enters the next time, it's really interesting what happens to us, I think, when that happens. Even if a single note, even if a cello just plays a single B quietly and kind of sneaks in, it completely changes the experience.
Wow.
With just that little bit of musical information. There's no melody, there's no harmony, just the sound alone immediately imparts this thing that wasn't there before.
It changes the energy of everything.
Yeah, it's really amazing.
And it is, I think, extraordinary that there are a number of movies and TV shows, and all you have to do is play the first 3 or 4 notes of that theme, and you know exactly what show it is. It dredges up all the memories that you had of watching it. It makes you maybe want to watch it again, or maybe never want to watch it again. Depends upon your feeling about that piece. And that's all music. It has nothing to do with picture. Your brain fills in all the rest.
Yeah, I know. It's really fascinating.
It is fascinating. So, all right. So, do you have a favorite movie you've worked on, or a TV show? Was it JAG, or is there something that just steps out as the thing for you?
Perhaps because it's the most recent one, but the last movie that I did, I'm very proud of, and I think it's among my favorite. I don't know if I have a favorite, but it's certainly among my favorites.
What's
It's
that?
this movie. In the introduction, you referred to it, Dominion. It actually has a new name. It's called Last Call now.
Last Call.
Last Call, but it is about the life and work of Dylan Thomas, the Welsh poet, and that was a project that I really enjoyed working on because, it was certainly challenging, but it's a wonderful movie and really, really beautifully acted and shot and written, and it's had lots of opportunities for me to try some different things. On the face of it, it may not sound that different. It's a score for strings and a piano and harp. It's a small group, but I don't know. It's just something about the visuals and the story. It's shot, it's primarily shot in black and white. Most of the story takes place in New York in the 1950s, but there are flashbacks to Wales.
Right.
And those are in color. So the back and forth is really interesting. And, I was thinking about what we were just saying a minute ago about, where do you find how do you find the approach you want to take for a visual, of all the infinite number of choices and where it comes from. I mean, I'm sort of, as you can tell, I'm sort of thinking out loud. I don't have an easy answer to this, but the way the movie starts is there's like this up tilt to the camera of a young boy running through the snowy woods in Wales. And there's a spoken, almost whispering dialogue of Dylan Thomas speaking, reading, and choosing what it is that I did to play over that, which is fairly simple, but in the way we were just discussing, I feel really evocative in its simplicity. There's something that it's adding, all the choices that one could make. Why that? And I don't know why, but it's what I felt. It's what I felt.
As a great poet, sometimes we don't know why they're writing what they're writing, but we get something from it nevertheless.
Yeah.
It's sort of the same thing. All right. I'm just curious, in your experiences, is there anything that you have learned over time that you always now do that in the beginning maybe you didn't do so much of, that you now repeat, that is helpful to you?
I can't think of anything specific, to be honest with you, Steve.
Is there anything then the reverse of that? Is there anything that you've learned over time that you did, and then you realized, I'm never going to do this again? I don't want to have this happen to me again.
This may not be the answer you're looking for or expect, but what it calls to mind for me, and I'm speaking personally and I'm being very honest, is to trust myself.
To trust yourself. I think that's exceptionally a good answer. I mean, because you're saying that in the beginning of your career, you didn't trust yourself.
Well, there's a kind of a continual questioning, like a reevaluation constantly. Is that going to work? Is it going to, is that maybe there's, and so what happens is the search becomes endless because you're constantly questioning. Was this good enough? Or is it right? Is this as right as it could be? And so you're because you're constantly questioning it, you're never able to settle on it and then move with it. One of the things that I also often remember is something with all jazz musicians, I've been taught this and I've heard this, is that there are no wrong notes. Okay, so if you're improvising and you hit a clam, let's call it, it isn't a wrong note, you turn it into the right note by what you do with it, right? So using that kind of analogy in coming up with an idea, yes, you have to do the homework of finding your theme and doing that, but in terms of the trust, once you get to a certain point, enough with the questioning, and now work with it, make it work. And usually it does. You just use your craft and your skill and you move forward. I
think you have just succinctly described what artists do and what they're about.
Okay.
I would say that is what all artists experience, is that if you knew what the answer was before you started, it would be not very worthwhile to do. It would, the part of being an artist is the struggle to find, and that's what you're talking about.
Yes, but the antimatter, the anti-force against that is the doubt, is the questioning that doesn't allow you to move forward, to let it be.
Well, now you're talking about how many great artists have there been in the history of the world that have a degree of neurosis. That's what you're talking about, is that we all people that create question what they're doing, and you're no different than anyone else. But what you've learned is to trust yourself.
Yeah.
And I think that that's something you probably gained only over a long time of doing it. And
for me, it has taken a long time. And I still deal with it now. Not as much. You know, we are who we are. And but yes, absolutely. It is a long learned lesson, but one that I've come to know it's really, really important.
Does you feel more satisfying to you when you've come to that feeling of acceptance of who you are and what you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean,
I'm going to guess many people who are listening to this will understand exactly what you're talking about.
Well, you know, I have a young son. Well, I mean, he's a teenager now, but you know, when he's struggling with work, particularly creative work, whether it's writing or something like that, I tell him what I try to tell myself is just put it down, put the idea down, and just write and go. And then when you're done, then you go back and you edit it.
Yep, you know? Absolutely.
Because if you critique yourself at the beginning, you'll never write it down, and you'll never start. And the point is to start, and the trust comes in knowing that in the end it will work out. The other part of this that we haven't talked about is craft. One of the ways that we're able to trust ourselves is to accept that we have a certain amount of craft, that we have the ability to do it, to work it out, to take a lemon and turn it into lemonade.
It's taking your skill set and becoming a professional about it by working it. And you can't get that craft without doing it and doing it and doing it.
Exactly.
I mean, I've been teaching now for close to 10 years to writers. And one of the things we talk about constantly in there is you just have to kind of just do. You can't go down to the corner store, and there is no composer store down on the corner where you can go buy this week's TV score. You have to actually do the work.
Right.
And that a lot of that is craft. It's an art and a craft. So you have to have the artistic viewpoint, the skill set, but you also have to have the ability to understand all of the mechanics of it, all of the discipline of it, all that. That's all craft.
That's right. I agree.
And I think that there's a great deal of value in understanding that without that, you probably aren't going to have much of a career.
I don't see how. You know, I mean, people come to this from all different angles. You know, there's people who, like me, who kind of come later. And you know, for me, I have a master's degree from a conservatory. Others who went direct from high school right into a fine music school, and they knew from day one what they wanted to do and studied. And there's other people who never went to music school and formally trained, but they all can have successful careers. And I think it's due to the one thing you mentioned at the beginning, is that music and scoring, because we're talking about scoring, is about communicating emotion. And as long as you can feel and understand emotions, you're probably going to find a way to get it out and express it, whether or not you have a formal music degree or you've just taught yourself to play guitar. If you can communicate the emotion, some director's going to hear that, and that's going to be enough.
Well, and the beauty part about music is there's virtually no limit. You know, you can have Steve Bramson, you can have John Williams, you can have Carter Burwell, and the three are going to be very different. And yet you're going to get a result of some kind that's going to drive an emotion.
And again, you know, because I think that, and I think this is even more applicable today in the modern world, a little goes a long way. And if you understand the power of music, even if, you know, you feel that you don't possess the skill and depth of craft and skill that other composers can, if you have that understanding of the power of music, a little can be extremely successful in a film.
So you don't need it to be schmaltzy.
No, schmaltzy is not in style anymore.
Not in vogue at the moment, for sure.
Sentiment out the window.
A little simpler and just more direct is probably better. I like it better when it's stripped down. I also love lush scores too, and that's what you had with Jag, which was very lush.
Well, you know, when I fell in love with film music, I mean, you know, Elmer Bernstein, Laurence Rosenthal, Leonard Rosenman, and even going back further, Miklos Rosa. These were a lot of, well, not all, but the earlier ones were all emigres from, you know, Europe, and many of them were steeped in this romantic tradition. Korngold, Eric Korngold, one of the great film composers of all time. I mean, he rivaled any concert composer and created, in a certain sense, a style of romantic film scoring along with a lot of the others of that time. But now people don't write like that, nor do they want that.
No, that's correct. Well, we've been talking for close to an hour, and we're going to kind of wind this thing down a little bit, if you don't mind. You have clearly worked with and met many people in the industry, and you've had lots of experiences. Do you have a story that you can share with us that's either oddball or strange or quirky or weird or just plain funny?
Well, when you ask me this question, you know, the first thing that comes to my mind, and I've told this story many times, and the more I tell it, I realize it's not as uncommon as I thought it was. But it's just an embarrassing one of these things that happened to me. I was working with Larry. I was living in LA, and he was living in the Oakland area. I happened to have family up there, cousins and aunts and uncles. And so when I worked with him, I would go up and I would live up there and work with him. We were doing a TV movie, I think, that was scoring in LA. And I was going down in advance that day to hand off music to the copyist for the session that was going to be the next morning, or it might have even been later that day. I don't remember. So I've got all his sketches and all the scores with me. And I get on the plane out of Oakland, and I'm in the airport, and I'm looking out the window, and the airplane, looking out the window and thinking about it. And suddenly I realize, where's the music? And I totally panicked. I looked on the overhead, I looked down below, and I didn't have it. And I ran up, I flagged down the stewardess, and I said, I've got to get a message. She went to the pilot, and they tried to call back because I said, I think I left it at the airport or something. And she came back and said, I'm sorry, we're out of range from the tower now, or something like this. There was a phone on the, you know, they had phones in the back of the seats. And I took one and I called Larry's house. I felt terrible, and I prayed that he didn't answer and his wife would answer, because I could tell her. She did. I told her what happened. She was extremely sweet about it. She said, don't worry. You know, look into it. And so the rest of the flight, I told her what I thought happened. You know, I said, I think I left it at the, you know, the bell cap, the bellman, you know, really the sky cap. So I land there, just completely panicked. And I called her. She found it. The sky cap had found it. I'd left it on the sky cap. He put it aside. He didn't throw it away. And when Larry came later to get his flight, he picked it up. And so later that night, part of my job was to pick Larry up at the airport.
Oh.
And I had to drive up to the curb, and when I pulled up, he's standing there with this look like, you lucky son of a bitch. And he was standing there with the music, because there was no other copy. I had his sketches and the scores.
Oh my goodness.
Anyway, but I've heard that there's others who've had these kinds of stories, so I'm not the only one.
Oh, there are lots of stories, of course, about being on location and the footage coming back and being crushed or ruined, and they have to go reshoot the whole thing. So yes, those things do happen. That's not that unusual. But that for you, and then for you to then go pick him up.
Yes. By then I knew Diana had told me that they'd found it, so I knew everything was going to be okay. But I didn't know how he would react. Whether he would just say you're fired, or what? I didn't know what he would do. Was
he amused?
He was amused, but also he scolded me. He says, "You're one lucky son of a bitch, and don't you ever let that happen again." You know. And
that never happened again, I'm sure.
Of course not.
Because every time was a little bit of a freak out.
Well,
knowing you better do it.
Though, if you can imagine, Steve, I had the originals and the sketches. There would be no way to reconstruct that for a recording session the next day. That would have been ruinous. So anyway,
and expensive.
sheesh, yeah. Anyway,
All right, last question for today. Do you have a solid piece of advice or a tip that you can lend to those that may be just trying to get into the industry now or in the business, or maybe they're in a little bit and trying to get to the next level?
well, I think for someone who wants to get into it, I would think of two things. One, in terms of yourself, uh, work on your musical voice. Work towards finding your musical voice.
What is your musical voice? Explain.
It's you, who you are. What is your musical expression? What is your sound? What is your expression? What makes you unique from the others that are, out there? Develop that. Develop the sense of yourself as an artist, as in, whatever that is for you, whether
Mhm.
it's guitar-based music, whether it's, new age, I don't know, whatever it is, whatever your voice is, work, work on that, develop that, and expose yourself to as much as you can, learn and soak up as much as you can. But I guess what I'm alluding to is that when I started out, I don't know where it came from, but I had the understanding to be successful, you had to wear many hats. You had to be able to, write adventure music. You had to sound like John Williams. You had to sound like this guy. You had to be able to do anything because you never knew who was going to call and what they'd want. What I'm saying is, rather than go that way, focus more on your own personal voice. And that way, I think the way a product is being created today and the interest in all kinds of new individualized, projects and the different streaming services that are much more open to variety and different interests, that there's an opportunity for your sound, your personal sound, to attract the ear of someone looking for something. That's my advice. And the second part of that, and then I'll do that,
Sure.
is that is in any way possible, try to make connections with filmmakers, whether that means if you're going to university and they have a film department, find those people, get to know them, get to see if you can help them with their projects. So many times those relationships that are developed, particularly in college and university, go on to blossom later. You align yourself with other creatives who have a path that's sort of, parallel to your own. Get in on those things early if you can.
Those are two very excellent pieces of advice. They hold true, I think, for, again, artists in general, not just musicians, composers, whatever, that you need to find who you are to express, that you're not trying to just copy others. You eventually must become who you are as an artist, and then to seek out others who will hopefully take the same lifelong journey with you, and that way introduce you to many other people as well. I think those are two extremely sound pieces of advice. Steve Bramson, this has been a fascinating and very fun hour plus of learning about how one operates in Hollywood, in particular, in a composing career. I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for being on the show today.
It was great fun, Steve. Good to see you. Good to talk to you, and good to hear you doing such a wonderful project.
Oh, well, thank you very much. And as promised, Steve has gifted us with a real treat. Please enjoy now two pieces of Steve's work. This is Live and Well, and followed by It's You. And so we've come to the end of today's Story Beat. If you like this podcast, please take a moment to give us a rating or review on whatever app or platform you're listening to. Your support helps us bring more great Story Beat episodes to you. Until next time, I'm Steve Cuden, and may all your stories be unforgettable.